time you bring me, I think I'll choose the trunk of the car. Shortly before I left, in fact yesterday, I received an email from a friend of mine about his conversion. He said, when I became a Christian in England some 31 years ago, I dismissed the Catholic Church because outwardly in England, I could see in it only charlatans and reformers. The words are usually interchangeable. Allergic to Latin, allergic seemingly even to the creeds, and competing with the Christian liberals of every other sect to make the most fatuous possible proclamations about worldly matters they knew less than nothing about. That is how I became an Anglican. At the time, and to my untrained eyes, the Anglican Church looked Catholic. At least the part I was looking at looked Catholic. All Souls this year will mark the 25th anniversary of the day I almost sued for membership in the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, for having then been Christian for 6 years or so, I had begun to know more about Christianity. The worst of the 70s were over. Surely that decade was the nadir of Western civilization. We've only since risen because we could not go lower. Even if it is what the stockbrokers call the dead cat bounce. I was beginning to look at the Catholic Church over 20 centuries instead of 20 minutes. That was about the time I began to be nauseating to my fellow Anglicans by taking the Roman side in almost every controversy. Why didn't I join them? The emotional energy I had expended in passing from atheism through theism to Christianity left me exhausted. And I would still have felt a twit leaving the Anglican fold seemingly minutes after joining it. I hunkered down and spent the next 20 years simply avoiding reading Newman, while praying for some sort of glitzy-ditzy church reunion so that I could ride to Rome on a tour bus with a guide speaking Cranmer's English, as it were, instead of having to walk. Looking back, how I paid for that mistake. Without going into details, I mean. For had I only become a Catholic then, almost every major thing that went wrong in later life could not have happened. And I would have had to make other mistakes entirely. So, although I'm not a Newman scholar, I think I'm a friend of Newman, and I too didn't resist the temptation to read him. And in case you might make mistakes in your life from not having been introduced to Newman, I hope to do that today to you, and to take the method of introducing you to his voice, as we've already heard. It's almost sacrilege to think of writing a lecture about this man, trying to digest what he's already said so beautifully into your own scholarly and pallid prose. So I want to read many things from his book, The Apologia, to you, so you will begin to hear his voice and to know the man. There's something uncanny about all of his writing, but especially about the story of his conversion, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. When you finished reading it, you think you would know him if he walked into the room. There's a palpable sense of his personality, of who he is. It is indeed a case of cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaking to heart, the title that was given to me for this talk. It was the motto that Newman chose when he was made a cardinal, and it was also embroidered on the funeral pall that lay across his coffin at the Requiem Mass when he finally died at a very old age, the Birmingham Oratory. Avoiding Newman is a typical Anglican phenomenon. When I was still an Anglican, most people would say, well, someday I will read Newman. But you know, there's a saying that when you start reading Newman seriously, you aren't much longer for this church. He will drag you with him to Rome by some devious method, apparently. It was even a boast. I had one friend who said, well, we grew up in the highest diocese, Fond du Lac, in the United States, and we weren't even afraid to read Newman. In her case, though, she did become a Catholic later on and is now an abbess in an English monastery. So, as his great biographer Sheridan Gilley has said, Anglican converts to Rome feel a special proprietorship in Newman as their patron and prototype, the greatest of all those among them who have crossed the Tiber. Here is their own little story on an epic scale and with a proper hero, who, like them, was not born into the Catholic purple, but found the pearl of great price only after a long and arduous journey. The phrases of Monsignor Ronald Knox, the convert who supremely inherited Newman's literary versatility and fastidiousness, Newman is the great auk among Anglican converts, and his spiritual Odyssey or Aeneid is their own. I spoke already about the power of Newman's voice, and you had a sense of that from the first quotation of many that you will hear today. This is a power which has been noted by almost all of his friends. Muriel Spark, the English novelist, said, Newman's is a voice that never fails to start up, radioactive from the page, however musty the physical book. In fact, mostly his books are available in the Longman's Complete Works edition, and they are pretty musty if you get a hold of them these days. However musty the physical book, it was by way of Newman, she said, that I turned Roman Catholic. Not all the beheaded martyrs of Christendom, the ecstatic nuns of Europe, the 5 proofs of Aquinas, or the pamphlets of my Catholic acquaintance provided anything like the answers that Newman did. Newman, she says, is far less dead to me than many of my contemporaries. But having whetted your interest in this man and promised great revelations from reading his beautiful prose, I have to also admit that when I've recommended the book Apologia Pro Vita Sua to various people, they don't always take to it. There are 2 reactions. One is, I stayed up all night reading it. It was like a mystery story. I wanted to know how it came out. It was so exciting. I felt that I knew the man by the time that I was finished it. And the other is, what a very puzzling book. It doesn't really have a beginning. It doesn't really have an end. It starts out by cobbling together some correspondence, a book review, a few pamphlets that were published, and you were thrown into the middle of a controversy you don't know anything about and really can't get to the bottom of. And then at the end, there's bunches of appendices, and you wonder, am I supposed to read this? Is this like Tolkien, you know, where... And not everyone takes to Newman. It's very puzzling. One of the people who didn't take to him immediately was another famous Anglican convert, the monk Thomas Merton. He says, when talking about his conversion, that there were various writers who sung him into the church. There was a music most deep with me. But Newman wasn't among these musical voices. Only later that he came to appreciate him. He says Newman was a profoundly musical person, and all that was best expressed itself for him in terms of music, harmony, oneness, sound. There are people one meets in books or in life whom one does not merely observe, meet, or know. A deep resonance one's entire being is immediately set up with the entire being of the other. cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart in the wholeness of the language of music. True friendship is a kind of singing. Yet for a long time, I had no resonance with Newman because I did not bother to listen for any. I think pictures of him scared me. I was suspicious of letting him in. But now I am with difficulty restrained from taking too many books of Newman out of the library. And I have more books than I need already. A person who heard Newman himself speaking from the pulpit of St. Mary's back in Oxford when he gave his famous parochial and plain sermons. Matthew Arnold has given us a classic passage on the aesthetic charm of Newman's voice. Who could resist the charm of that spiritual apparition, gliding in the dim afternoon light through the aisles of St. Mary's, rising into the pulpit, and then in the most entrancing of voices, breaking the silence with words and thoughts which were of a religious music, subtle, sweet, mournful. Novelist A.N. Wilson, who himself had a rather remarkable series of conversions and deconversions and, who knows, probably reversions before the end of his life, said in compiling an anthology of Newman's works when he was on the way out of the Anglican Church for the second time to become an atheist, many of the things which mattered so much to him seem almost pathetically remote. Yet, for a brief period of my life, in my late teens, I was almost in love with Newman and read him obsessively. Now my teenage self seems almost as remote to me as the Victorians do. Was it merely an aesthetic attraction? He still seems to me incomparably the most flawless English stylist. The music of his prose still has the power to turn me to gooseflesh. But is it that alone? The honest man of Littlemore, who was prepared to change the course of his entire life for what he believed, will never fail to move me. And throughout his writings, every so often, one comes across a paragraph of disturbing religious power. Let me read you something simple so you know how the story comes out. You already know the end of the detective story. This is a great counterpart. We didn't arrange this, Lou, now did we? But this is a great counterpart to the conversion of Mr. Ryder from the novel Loss and Gain. This is Newman's own conversion, and you'll, I think, hear how he transmuted his experience into that fictional account. It's much simpler. The language is much simpler. But it's still, when I was speaking to Father Robinson of the Oratory, who was originally supposed to give this talk, I said, I have been rereading the Apologia, and I find it strange that it still has the power to move me the way it does. And he says, oh yes, I cry every time I read it. And this is one of those passages where, especially coming to it at the end of the entire story of his change of mind, and you're just about ready to clap for him, but it can also make you cry, and with very simple language. One of my friends at Littlemore, this is the monastic retreat where he had gone after he decided that there were problems with the Church of England that made it impossible for him to continue speaking and preaching as publicly as he had. One of my friends at Littlemore had been received into the church on Michaelmas Day at the Passionist House at Aston, near Stone, by Father Dominic, the Superior. At the beginning of October, the latter was passing through London to Belgium, and as I was in some perplexity what steps to take for being received myself, I assented to the proposition made to me, that the good priest should take Littlemore in his way, with a view to doing for me that same charitable service as he had done to my friend. On October the 8th, I wrote to a number of friends the following letter. Littlemore, October 8th, 1845. I am this night expecting Father Dominic, the Passionist, who from his youth has been led to have distinct and direct thoughts, first of the countries of the north, then of England. After 30 years, almost, waiting, he was without his own act sent here, but he has had little to do with conversions. I saw him here for a few minutes on St. John Baptist's Day last year. He is a simple, holy man, and withal gifted with remarkable powers. He does not know of my intention, but I mean to ask of him admission into the one fold of Christ. I have so many letters to write that this must do for all who choose to ask about me. P.S. This will not go till all is over. Of course, it requires no answer. I left Oxford for good on Monday, February 23rd, 1846. On this Saturday and the Sunday before, I was in my house at Littlemore simply by myself, as I had been the first day or two when I had originally taken possession of it. I slept on Sunday night at my dear friend's, Mr. Johnson's, at the observatory. Various friends came to see the last of me: Mr. Copeland, Mr. Church, Mr. Buckle, Mr. Pattison, and Mr. Lewis. Dr. Pusey, too, came up to take leave of me, and I called on Dr. Ogle, one of my very oldest friends, for he was my private tutor when I was an undergraduate. In him, I took leave of my first college, Trinity, which was so dear to me, and which held on its foundation so many who have been kind to me, both when I was a boy and all through my Oxford life. Trinity had never been unkind to me. There used to be much snapdragon growing on the walls opposite my freshmen's rooms there, and I had for years taken it as the emblem of my own perpetual residence, even unto death, in my university. On the morning of the 23rd, I left the observatory. I have never seen Oxford since, excepting its spires, as they are seen from the railway. That is how it comes out. Now, this book, the Apologia, what I want to do is to give you some overview, because I've been assured that not everyone here knows about Newman. So a little bit about the story. But for those of you who do know all these things already, and for whom that would be somewhat tiresome, even if you get to hear him say part of it over again, I also want to focus on this notion of the music and the personal aspect of his voice. That's part of what he has to say to us. His conversion is an interesting dialectic of affectivity and reason. And throughout this book, he talks both about the way he felt about things and the conversion of the affect, and about the way he thought about things and the need for correcting affectivity in a kind of logical way. And sometimes you think he's saying, and in fact he does say, that what is most important is the heart, and at other times he insists that he's not going to let his heart lead him, but that he must confirm everything by a kind of logical working out. This dialectic between the head and the heart, then, is what I think is useful to look at in reading the book. And I have a few remarks at the end about the usefulness of Newman's particular style of apologetics. Now, the book, one of the reasons why it's so hard to read is because it started out, simply enough, as a response to a charge made by Charles Kingsley, in a book review of Froude's History of England. In the Macmillan's Magazine of January 1864, he drops the following comment. Truth for its own sake had never been a virtue with the Roman clergy. Father Newman informs us that it need not, and on the whole, ought not to be. Newman has been called a liar, and not only Newman, but all Catholic priests. And he feels that he has to come to the defense, not only of himself, but of his church and of his fellow priests. He does this, first of all, by writing a letter to the magazine. And we get, at the beginning of some editions anyway, this sort of complete correspondence in which Kingsley never gives him the satisfaction that he wants. Some of it is in fact very funny, but we don't have time to read all of Newman's little zingers at this point. In the end, Kingsley got far more than he bargained for, because Newman sat down and produced this apologia, this defense of his life. And in doing so, he won over the English people really for the first time to the fact that Catholics could be, not degenerates, that there could be a genuine and pure love of truth in the Catholic Church. He won them back over to himself. A kind of cloud had always sort of hung over him and his intentions. And he also made friends again with all of these people that he had said, or many of these people that he had said goodbye to when he was leaving Oxford. Because all of his old friends came back and gave him letters that would be useful. We heard before about the problem of memory. Newman had some letters at his disposal, but not the huge Newman archive that now exists at the Birmingham Oratory. It was only a few boxes of things. He went through those and put out a call to some of his friends to supply him with their recollections and with their letters. And it was a great opportunity for him once again to renew friendships and to somehow repair breaches that had risen as a result of his conversion. Well, so it's a very personal book. I mean, I said there's a kind of mystery to it. You want to know how it comes out. But it's also a little bit like the joy you get from reading someone else's mail. You can do this without any sort of fear that you're doing something wrong. You are at first listening in on a conversation that started without you and that seems to be very personal, and you wonder if it has anything to do with you. But in the end, if you bear with it, it can. Now, there's a lot of arcane theological controversy. Many of these things, as Ann Wilson said, seem to us from another world, another time. The issues aren't current in that form, at any rate. Many things are still very much with us, and Newman was largely prophetic about what was going to happen to the world and to the church. But you can, I think, abstract from, and it's helpful for getting to know him, you can abstract from a lot of the logical argumentation, a lot of the theological polemics, and just listen to the people talking to each other. And it starts out with an argument between Newman and Kingsley. At a certain point, he dismisses Kingsley. But he tells, at the very beginning, he sets him up as the interlocutor. He says, I am in warfare with him, but I wish him no ill. It is very difficult to get up resentment towards persons whom one has never seen. Of course, if you lived in Newman's house, you knew that there could be resentments. People that he did see, there could be resentments. It is easy enough to be irritated with friends or foes vis-a-vis. But although I am writing with all my heart against what has been said of me, I'm not conscious of personal unkindness towards himself. I think it necessary to write as I am writing for my own sake and for the sake of the Catholic priesthood. But I wish to impute nothing worse to Mr. Kingsley than that he has been furiously carried away by his feelings. So we have speaking to Kingsley, and a kind of diagnosis of Kingsley's problem, namely that he's carried away by his feelings. So we know that this is entirely possible to happen, that Newman is aware of the difficulty of feeling. And one thing that may happen if you give yourself to feelings in an unbridled way. But shortly after this, he moves away from Kingsley, having started the controversy with Kingsley. He says, "Away with you, Mr. Kingsley, and fly into space. Your name shall occur again as little as I can help in the course of these pages. I shall henceforth occupy myself not with you, but with your charges." So we move from the person and his feelings to the argument. And this is what is always going on in the apologia. There is a kind of an input, kind of an effective input, distancing from that, logical argumentation, and then the result is a kind of music which can address the heart. The problem of music, or of kind of more than rational atmosphere that can pervade and move you, also is noted in the very beginning of the apologia. He says, I have trouble knowing what to respond to here. Because it's not just something that Kingsley has said to me, something strange, something unfounded. He says it's that he's allowed to get away with this because of a certain atmosphere that he has plugged himself into, and that the people around me are also feeling. It is the state of the atmosphere, he says. It is the vibration all around, which will more or less echo his bold assertion of my dishonesty. It is that prepossession against me, which takes it for granted that when my reasoning is convincing, it is only ingenious, and that when my statements are unanswerable, there's always much put out of sight or hidden up my sleeve. These are the real foes which I have to fight, the vibrations. And you do that, as he says, not by arguing, because the arguments could always be suspect. You do it by setting up a kind of counter vibration, by singing your own music and convincing people that this music is the music of an honest and honorable man. So it starts out with this very particular answer to a charge that's been made against him. How does it get to be the story of his conversion? He says, once he recognized this problem of the vibrations that were already echoing, reverberating against him, and making it impossible to hear him, I recognized what I had to do. Though I shrank both from the task and the exposure which it would entail, I must, I said, give the true key to my whole life. I must show what I am, that it may be seen what I am not, and that the phantom may be extinguished, which gibbers instead of me. I wish to be known as a living man, and not as a scarecrow which is dressed up in my clothes. False ideas may be refuted indeed by argument, but by true ideas alone are they expelled. I will indeed answer his charges and criticisms on me one by one, lest anyone should say that they are unanswerable. But such a work shall not be the scope nor the substance of my reply. I will draw out, as far as may be, the history of my mind. Or as he says, simply, I mean to be simply personal and historical. So, get the history of his mind insofar as it is related to religious opinions. Because this is related to the charge that he's answering about his duplicity. People have sometimes read this as if it were simply a biography, and they say, well, he wasn't interested in anything but religion. And that's to miss the point that, of course, the man did have many other interests, such as music. He played the violin, loved Beethoven above all as the composer of his heart, and was heavily involved in pastoral ministry when he went to Littlemore to recuperate himself and to decide what his future in the Anglican Church would be. He took up with the little girls in the parish and said, well, they don't have proper clothes, I must do something about that, and he outfitted them all. They all came to him then for catechism lessons. He was a deeply human person with many, many interests, prickly at times, but this book is about his religious beliefs. Now, he starts out by telling us about his childhood, what little he can remember about that. Always in these biographies that have childhood sections, you get just a glimpse, a few things, as if, going back to your own childhood, you have a few vivid scenes that have etched themselves in your memory forever, but not much more than that. Well, he says, I was brought up as a child to take great delight in reading the Bible, but I had no formed religious convictions until I was 15. He was in sort of a Bible-reading Anglican. But there is something else besides the Bible, which has a kind of, which he thinks at this time in his life, is a telling fact about his, and he's not quite sure what to make about this fact, but it's telling about his predisposition to the spiritual realm. He says, I used to wish the Arabian tales were true. My imagination ran on unknown influences, on magical powers and talismans. I thought life might be a dream, or I an angel, and all this world a deception. My fellow angels, by a playful device, concealing themselves from me, and deceiving me with the semblance of the material world. I was very superstitious, and for some time previous to my conversion, this is his first conversion, when I was 15, used constantly to cross myself, going into the dark. Well, not entirely clear where he picked that habit up from. He himself doesn't know, but he did it. Now, that's his childhood. Very much a child's reaction to religion and to the Spirit. When he was 14, he began to think, and he started reading Enlightenment tracts, Paine's tracts on the New Testament, some of Hume's essays, perhaps the essay on miracles, and Voltaire. He copied out some of these things in his copybook and said to himself, how dreadful, but how plausible. He was being, he saw the pull of the atheism that only became stronger and stronger and stronger in the society at that time, claiming his brother, for one. Now, the first conversion, his words are this. When I was 15, in the autumn of 1816, a great change of thought took place in me. Thought now. I fell under the influences of a definite creed and received into my intellect impressions of dogma, which through God's mercy have never been effaced or obscured. Again, the inward conversion of which I was conscious, and of which I am still more certain than I have hands and feet. So, it's first thought. This period lasts for about 5 months, and so using the model of conversion, the evangelical model of conversion, many evangelicals have said, well, it couldn't have been a real conversion if it took five months. It does, and he does emphasize also the importance of doctrine and the role of the intellect in this, rather than any sort of emotional conversion. He's given by his tutor, who has brought him to this stage, a number of Calvinist books to read, a number of evangelical things. But he also reads some of the older Anglican books as well, some purely historical things. There are 2 books, he says, produced a deep impression on me that same autumn of 1816, each contrary to each. and planting in me the seeds of an intellectual inconsistency which disturbed me for a long course of years. I read Joseph Milner's church history and was nothing short of enamored of the long extracts from St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, and other fathers which I found there. I read them as being the religion of the primitive Christians. But simultaneously with Milner, I read Newton on the prophecies, and in consequence became firmly convinced that the Pope was the Antichrist, predicted by Daniel, St. Paul, and St. John. My imagination was stained with the effects of this doctrine up to the year 1843, a long time. It had been obliterated from my reason and judgment at an earlier date, but the thought remained upon me as a sort of false conscience. So you see, and this is, I think, is an experience of all converts. They must know what he's talking about, that even when your intellect and reason have been convinced, and you are willing to admit in theory that such and such a thing is good and salutary, you find that you can't quite take part in it fully with all your heart yet, because there's a certain imagination. This woman that I said, from the highest diocese in the United States, they believed in the assumption. They had all of these things were preached from the pulpit, but she never could sort of stomach the Sacred Heart, because that was the thing. That was too Roman, okay, and somehow that always set up a reaction in her. Well, Newman, even after he got rid of the idea that the Pope was the Antichrist, still had the music was there, and he found it very, very difficult to draw near to a church that was headed up by someone who has this taint of being an Antichrist. Now, this is all high school Newman. When he comes to the university, which he did early, because of his being prepared so well by these teachers who favored him, he became involved with a group called the Oxford Noetics and learned from them the importance of reason and logic and criticism. This I learned from the provost of Oriel, Dr. Hawkins, the first who taught me to weigh my words and to be cautious in my statements. He led me to that mode of limiting and clearing my sense in discussion and in controversy, and of distinguishing between cognate ideas and of obviating mistakes by anticipation, which to my surprise has been since considered, even in quarters friendly to me, to savor of the polemics of Rome. This use of logic, like the schoolmen, Thomas Aquinas, the objections which are then clarified, a Roman practice, but not at all. I mean, it was taught to him by these rationalists at Oxford. But he also learned about tradition from Dr. Hawkins. And this important proposition stayed with him and was the seed of his further development. Hawkins lays down a proposition self-evident as soon as stated. I'm not sure about that, but it's true nonetheless. Self-evident to those who have at all examined the structure of Scripture, namely that the sacred text was never intended to teach doctrine, but only to prove it. And that if we would learn a doctrine, we must have recourse to the formularies of the Church, for instance, to the Catechism and to the creeds. He considers that after learning from them the doctrines of Christianity, the inquirer must verify them by Scripture. This view, most true in its outline, most fruitful in its consequences, opened upon me a large field of thought. The idea that the Bible and the Bible alone is the religion of the Protestants, that we can find here, this is where one goes for the teaching. It's in fact, I think, more accepted today that in the early church, the first armature of doctrine was always some form of catechesis, and the Scriptures were used for other things, but never, probably not even to prove doctrine. That's almost going too far. The idea that one doesn't go to the Bible for the initial understanding of doctrine, that this is something that comes from the Church. He also learned at this time another important principle that maintained itself, that deepened, developed throughout the course of his life, from Bishop Butler, an important ethicist and ecclesiastical writer, his analogy of religion. This, he found, was something that enabled him to set straight his hankering after the Arabian tales. Okay, whatever it was that made him like those sort of magical things, this intimation that there's more to reality than just the stuff that you touch and that can be manipulated, the material realm. He had set in a kind of a logical way by reading Butler's analogy. He says the very idea of an analogy, that is to say, a likeness between the separate works of God, leads to the conclusion that the system which is of less importance is economically or sacramentally connected with the more momentous system. The theory to which I was inclined as a boy, namely the unreality of material phenomena, is now put in its proper place. In other words, he sees that there is an analogy between the spiritual realm and the material realm, that indeed the material realm is lower, it's of less importance, but that it's not something disconnected, it's not something unreal, but it's something that can be affected sacramentally by the Spirit, and which operates in some way the way the Spirit operates. Also, he learned from Butler something that he refines and deepens and corrects later on, namely that probability is the guide of life. It's the thing that gives logical cogency to faith. We can't have mathematical or definitive apodictic proofs, but we can have converging probabilities, as he will later say. The famous logician and economist Whately, he also learned much from. Later they had their falling out. But he said he was a generous and warm heart, first thing he says about Whately. But he also opened my mind, taught me to think and use my reason. What he did for me in point of religious opinion was first to teach me the existence of the church as a substantive body or corporation. Next, to fix in me those anti-Erastian views of church polity, which were one of the most prominent features of the Tractarian movement. Anti-Erastian, namely, against the idea that the state should control the church, something which was clearly going on throughout the history of the Church of England, and also in some other Catholic countries at various times. Now, these are all bits and pieces of things that have to be readjusted. Some of them have to be discarded altogether, namely the idea of the Pope as the Antichrist. But you can see how from these things that struck him as so important and as a way of understanding his Christianity, he would be eventually led to the church. We have the ecclesial importance of Christian life. We have the sacramental principle. We have the importance of the lesser importance of the state, and the use of reason along with what we receive from biblical revelation, and the importance of tradition in understanding revelation. Now, what about music? That comes up explicitly at this time. His friend Keble produced a work called The Christian Year, which was a series of poems based on the Gospels and Epistles of the church year in the Anglican prayer book. They were, by the way, the same Gospels and Epistles that were read in the Catholic Church until the new Missal came out. So if you're now celebrating the Old Mass, you can go back and look at what Keble has to, what sort of poem he wrote about this particular Sunday. Now, the Christian Year made its appearance in 1827. When the general tone of religious literature was so nerveless and impotent as it was at that time, Keble struck an original note and woke up in the hearts of thousands a new music, the music of a school long unknown in England. Nor can I pretend to analyze in my own instance the effect of religious teaching so deep, so pure, so beautiful. I have never till now tried to do so. Yet I think I am not wrong in saying that the two main intellectual truths which it brought home to me were the same two which I had learned from Butler. First of these may be called sacramentality, in a large sense of the word. And he learned also, again, he saw coming up the idea that probability was the guide of life, although now, as Keble sings to him, he extends this idea. This is sort of extension of an idea which is already present in his mind, is absolutely typical of him. Probability becomes personal authority. He says, Butler teaches us that probability is the guide of life. The danger of this doctrine, in the case of many minds, is its tendency to destroy in them absolute certainty, leading them to consider every conclusion as doubtful and resolving truth into an opinion, which it is safe indeed to obey or profess, but not possible to embrace with true internal assent. I considered that Mr. Keble met this difficulty by ascribing the firmness of assent which we give to faith and love which accepted it, to religious doctrine, not to the probabilities which introduced it, but to the living power of faith and love which accepted it. It is faith and love which give to probability a force which it has not in itself. Faith and love are directed towards an object. In the vision of that object they live. It is that object received in faith and love, which renders it reasonable to take probability as sufficient for internal conviction. Thus, the argument from probability in the matter of religion becomes an argument from personality, which in fact is one form of the argument from authority. So, from probability to personality to authority, and all because the object, which is the resolution of these things, is himself a person, someone who can be trusted and who is reached by faith and by love. It's another important, for his later development, friend that he made at this time, contemporary, Harold Froude, who was a pupil of Keble's, this great poet. Froude was sort of a madman. He was certainly ahead of his time, probably one of those Oxford eccentrics. And Newman says, he taught me to look with admiration towards the Church of Rome, and in the same degree to dislike the Reformation. He fixed deep in me the idea of devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and he led me gradually to believe in the real presence. Now, Froude would go around, he read the Roman breviary, he took the discipline, he was always arguing that the Reformation was a bad thing for England, and that these Catholic things had something, the Middle Ages were far better than anything else, and it was partly a pose. I mean, he died very young, and he never became a Catholic, but he was quite brilliant, and Newman thought perhaps even more brilliant than he was, and Newman couldn't follow him all this way. I mean, he still, the reverberations of the Pope as the Antichrist continued long after Froude suggesting that he was not. What Newman recognizes at this time is that there is an enemy. And it's this enemy that he devoted himself to fighting. And in the fight against it, he eventually found himself cornered back into the Catholic Church. The enemy is liberalism. And his first tutors were the ones who taught him to reason. Some of them were involved in this liberal encroachment on the ecclesiastical establishment. But he says, in proportion as I moved out of the shadows of liberalism, which had hung over my course, my early devotion to the fathers of the church returned. He had been introduced to them in high school in that church history book. And in the long vacation of 1828, I set about to read them chronologically, beginning with St. Ignatius and St. Augustine. And when he reads the fathers, what does he find again but music? He speaks about the music of Clement of Alexandria and Origen. Some portions of their teaching, magnificent in themselves, came like music to my inward ear, as if the response to ideas which, with little external to encourage them, I had cherished so long. These were based on the mystical or sacramental principle and spoke of the various economics or dispensations of the eternal. I understood these passages to mean that the exterior world, physical and historical, was but the manifestation to our senses of realities greater than itself. Nature was a parable. Scripture was an allegory. Pagan literature, philosophy, and mythology, properly understood, were but a preparation for the gospel. The Greek poets and sages were in a certain sense prophets, for thoughts beyond their thought to those high bards were given. There had been a directly divine dispensation granted to the Jews, but there had been in some sense a dispensation carried on in favor of the Gentiles. He who had taken the seed of Jacob for his elect people had not therefore cast the rest of mankind out of his sight. In the fullness of time, both Judaism and paganism had come to naught. The outward framework, which concealed yet suggested the living truth, had never been intended to last, and it was dissolving under the beams of the sun of justice which shone behind it and through it. The process of change had been slow. It had been done not rashly, but by rule and measure, at sundry times and in diverse manners. First one disclosure and then another, till the whole evangelical doctrine was brought into full manifestation. And thus room was made for the anticipation of further and deeper disclosures, of truths still under the veil of the letter, and in their season to be revealed. The visible world still remains without its divine interpretation. Holy Church, in her sacraments and her hierarchical appointments, will remain, even to the end of the world, only a symbol of those heavenly facts which fill eternity. For mysteries are but the expression in human language of truths to which the human mind is unequal. It is evident how much there was in all this in correspondence with the thoughts which had attracted me when I was young, and with the doctrine which I have already associated with the analogy and the Christian year. So, the enemy is liberalism. We have the seeds of something that can develop into sort of a full-blown Catholicism, and the very sense that what is involved in this is not only a matter of doctrine and reason and logical presentation, but also an eruption of the superior spiritual world into the realm of materiality and organization of some mysterious backdrop. There's more to the world than we imagine and that we think. This, I would suggest to you, is revealed by Newman's luminous prose. He somehow convinces us that we live in a world in which the supernatural is real, in which the supernatural is substantial, more real, and that by following out the clues that he was providentially given at the beginning of his life, we can come to see as a place where that truth finally lies. He gives us an image. He said, The difference ultimately for him between Anglicanism and Catholicism was this: the two ways of looking at Our Lady. Our Lady holding the child in her breast, in her bosom, enveloping him, which is the Mother Church of the Catholics, who will bring out. She somehow is the mothering source of faith, and can during the course of history bring out and develop, in the same way that he was already beginning to do, the doctrines of the Fathers and of antiquity, or Mary standing at the foot of the cross, side, separate, and sort of looking at the Redeemer, perhaps pointing to him, but always separate from him. And he says that was the Anglican view of antiquity, of the Fathers, that we must somehow always regard doctrine as something separate, as something which isn't living, as something which isn't part of the Church, and can't come forth from her as some kind of loving mother. That's what it took him a long time to uncover. And so what we find, just to sum up, I think, in Newman, is we don't find a fully developed theology. We don't find any metaphysics, and it would be very nice if, as he says, we had a cosmology in which the world was once again understood as fully as God's creation, understood in terms of its eternal purpose. We don't have that. We don't get that. We don't get anything like the metaphysical cosmology in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. But what we do get is this poetry. And Newman regards the Benedictines, the monastic tradition, as the poets of the faith. This historical poetry of Newman is something I think that we need to start with if we are to have any kind of conversion of the heart, and if we are to have any kind of conversion of our church in these days.